Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session on building culture competencies in financial services. I'm Marissa Calderon. I am Chief of Community Finance and Mobility at NCRC and also Executive Director of our CDFI. And with me today, I have Stacy Viadamas. She is SVP of Diverse Consumer Insights and Initiatives for the DE&I practice at Nielsen. She's been recognized also by Latina Style magazine as a top Latina executive and 3 years in a row recognized as one of the Imagen Foundation's most powerful and influential Latinos in entertainment. So welcome, Stacy. With me also is Maria Vergara. She's currently Director of Community Lending at Fannie Mae. Previously, she served as President of NARP Consulting Services also, which we'll hear more about in a little bit. Maria has also been recognized as a 2020 Keystone Award finalist by M Report. Welcome, Maria. And finally, Mike Valdez-Fowley. Mike is president and CEO of Pinta. It's one of the largest growing agencies in the country. Their clients include recognizable names like Comcast, Heineken, Microsoft, the NFL, Realogy, and T-Mobile. And Mike is also an accomplished writer who's been featured in publications that you'll all recognize, like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNN, and the Miami Herald, just to name a few outlets. So delighted to have you all here today and appreciate your contributions.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, so just to set a little bit of framework for what we're going to be talking about, the US has been undergoing a demographic shift for quite some time now, driven largely by communities of color. Latinos have been widely recognized as the fastest growing native-born demographic, over 60 million Latinos in the country, more than 18% of the country's population. The Black population is also large and growing, 46.8 million, 13% of the country's population. So really we're talking about over a third of the country's current population, and this segment is what's driving a lot of native-born growth in the United States. I'd love to be able to start just to level set on what it means to be culturally competent. So Maria, you started an agency that was really directed toward financial services, and I know a lot of the work that you did there was around cultural competencies. So I'd love if you can maybe start us off with just giving us a little bit of context for what it means to be culturally competent in outreach.
Sure. And again, thank you for having me. Cultural competency, the way that I would define it, is really the ability to connect with someone who is not from your native culture. I don't believe that you need to be from that particular culture, but you have to have an affinity to the experiences. And of course, if you're from that segment, that would come more naturally. But I wanted to say that first because I think that the thought that you have to be of that particular culture or segment makes people either afraid or maybe as an excuse or a crutch not to broach the topic because of that fear or insecurity. You just have to have a curious mind, be open, and connect with people on a genuine level.
Okay, great, thank you. So Stacy, I know that there's that you've done a lot of analysis and kind of looking at data with respect to different population segments. I wonder if you could, from your perspective at Nielsen, if you have any thoughts on cultural competency and how that plays a role in marketers' outreach. We'll go to you next, Mike.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and welcome everyone who's watching live. As Maria suggested, I think there's some, prior behaviors or thoughts that were pretty common, where they would think, well, let's just ensure that we have, someone in the room to dialogue about the community or represent the community. But most certainly, when you do real academic, research on different community groups, you come to realize what cultural competency really should look like based on how the community is today. And there are so many varying factors, right? And a lot of these, I think, are low-hanging fruit. Certainly, anyone in this space who's in marketing or who has been, for the last 10 or so years would know things, of course, like geography and the different groups within just, for example, the monolith of Latino, right? We saw actually a lot, evidence of how different people are culturally, even within the same group of Latinos. We saw that during the election, right? Post-election, we could very clearly see how our own community had very different reactions and feelings as a result of perhaps their home countries or the experiences that they had in their migration to the United States or their cultural history. So if you think about developing cultural competencies as a brand, when you're speaking out to communities and wanting to have relevant touch points, for me, and of course, this is with my researcher hat, having a really distinct understanding, not of just the group, but really the different cuts within any group, and dynamically looking through a cultural lens at these communities, certainly in the long run, allows you to have a better, ROI with any community group. And I know that that's not our goal here today, right? We're not just talking about how do we move product. What we're talking about is touch points. We're talking about relevancy. We're talking about resonating, but you can't do any of those unless you have a real understanding of culture, and you can't really have a good understanding of culture unless you have folks that are in the room that have done the right research and have the best understandings of how your brand or your products will really serve the community in the way that they are asking to be served.
And Mike, based on a lot of the experience that you have at FINTA, how does this play into both your own approach as well as some of the advice that you give to your clients?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I completely concur with my co-panelists on some of their commentary. For us, it's important to have nuance and respect. So rather than sort of lead with a stereotype, we try to look for an insight that is organic and authentic to the marketplace. One of the places that starts, and Stacey alluded to this, is that it's not one homogenous Hispanic market. It's a series of subsegments, from country of origin to language dominance to acculturation levels, whether you're first, second, or third generation. And so any product or service that is trying to kind of reach that audience needs to start from a place of saying, wow, I really need to do my homework. And the more homework you do, the more ROI you will get, as well as kind of raising the service that we're giving to the community that so direly needs it. I just want to touch on one other thing from Stacey's remarks. I agree with you. It's not all about moving product, but I'm always thrilled when there's shared value, right? So when it's not just a box to check for diversity or a check that you're blowing up in a photo op and then you go back to making money, if you could somehow combine the two, that's a win-win-win. That's where 1 + 1 can equal 3, because it becomes more sustainable for a company to continue giving back to the Latino community if they're also getting something tangible in return. And I think long ago there was some embarrassment. It was like a dirty word to try to segment and also benefit from that. But I think as long as it's done, as I said, with respect, with insights and not stereotypes, it could be a win-win.
And if I can just add to what you said, Mike, you exactly nailed it on the head, because when I think about, what you just said, like 1 + 1 is 3, if you're doing this right and you're having the right investment in the community, your yield is going to be greater. I mean, there's a lot of research already out there that talks about a dollar well invested in the Latino community and what your yield is, right? If that index is higher because you're reaching the community with relevancy, culturally competent, and you're reaching the community in the right way with the right message, your yield will be better than you can see traditionally speaking in general market communities. So 1 + 1 really does equal 3, which that's the incentive. That's the mutual component you're talking about. The incentive to do it right is it is going to yield better results. And again, not that it's all about that, but you're super serving the community, the right topics in the right way with the right product. They're receiving and responding to that in a way that gives you 2 times index over what you can do with a traditional dollar spent in a non-ethic.
Yeah, and the research actually bears that out for 2 big reasons. It's cheaper, frankly. If you're going to spend, if you're the chief marketing officer and you're looking at how you divide your limited budget, it's often a lower cost of entry to market to the Hispanic. And statistically, we are more brand loyal if we feel like you've done a good job of engaging us with respect. So if it's lower cost and a higher stickiness with the consumer in terms of brand loyalty, that's a recipe for success.
And more socially networked, I would add as well, right? So we tend to have stronger social networks, and even living situations are generally, more multi-generational or multifamily. So when we have a great experience, or the exponential voice that we have is there.
Yeah, and the research proves that out too. And I think it's interesting if you really look. We did some socioeconomic research on that a few years ago, or I shouldn't call socioeconomic, some social science research a few years ago, to try and understand like why this sort of word of mouth, because we all know it, right? We know Latinos are more social online. We know there's a lot more dialoguing and sharing of best practices and behaviors. But we want to understand, well, why is that? Why would this one community, and we see it in other ethnic communities as well, but why would it be like, why is there so much more, social yelping, if you will, and then there is another? We really wanted to sort of crack that open. And rather than taking you through the whole white paper, the high points are that it's really a function of how the Latino community grew up in the United States, our experience in the US. And I think, my family, think of any of us who are, if you're first generation or second, if you think back to how your family sort of came up, the structures that were in place to support minorities or even, English second language communities were like non-existent in the 60s and the 50s. They were just sort of on your own, right? And so as a result of that, the community banded together and began to share and network. How do we get, what does the education services look like? What do financial services look like? Which is why, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. How do you buy a home? How does this work? And the community recognized early on that the best resource was us, not because we didn't trust outside resources, there just really weren't any. So as a result, there's this really, we see it also with the African-American community for different reasons, but this close knit, this is a function of how the community has grown and, was planted and grown in the United States sort of on its own and resourcing within each other, that has now become a massive networking resource and opportunity for brands. If you can get in there in the right way, the Latino community will socialize your message. But I think what's interesting is to understand sort of why that came to be.
And if I could interject there too, a word of caution though, because we saw this in the recession. So after the recession in the mid 2000s, we got out of the housing crash, and we saw that communities of color, especially Latino and the African American segment, or Black segment, saw a tremendous loss of wealth. And what came out of that, from many had the mistaken thought that, look, these folks were risky. They're riskier than the general market, when in fact it was because the segments like the Hispanic segment, Latinx segment, believed so much in home ownership that's where all of their investment went, versus like a 401 or some other diversified plans. And so it was actually the belief in home ownership that led to those, unfortunately, that downward spiral of net wealth. And I worry also next year too, when people are looking at their spend, if they see a downward turn, but that's because of COVID. And what happened because of COVID was exasperated in minority segments because of what we're talking about, kind of that close knit, those networks and the extended families together. So just a word of caution, because you have to understand those numbers and the dynamics and how that might impact, and what you see at the surface may not necessarily tell the whole story.
Yeah, and Stacy, you mentioned some of that sort of social networking and how that came to be for the Latino community. And you alluded to that there are some similarities, but for different reasons for the Black community. If we could just talk a little bit about that, because these are two important segments, but for different reasons within the U.S. in terms of future growth potential within financial services, and the sort of positive effect that it can have on household wealth, which Maria just mentioned.
So for the Black community, it's actually the root reason is similar, which is trust, right? But the circumstances surrounding the need to pull in around trust are different. So for the Latino community, it was lack of resources, it was lack of access, there were language barriers, there were other reasons that brought the community in and developed these really interesting networks. And we've looked at these sort of networking maps and how information is transferred, like all of this really cool neuro data. And it's really interesting how almost the best information. It's not like a game of telephone. It's like the best possible game where the best information is what's transferring and being used. And we're actually subsequently growing more businesses that serve Latinos in that space because they are super serving. In the Black community, as I said, the root reason similar was trust. The community had understandingly and still does understandingly some trust barriers outside of the Black community. And so those same networks pulled together and, resourced around, based on trust. Who do we trust that can share information we can leverage, we can learn, we can grow, we can figure out how do we start a business? How do we educate our kids? How do we understand the financial system? How can we use it to our advantage with our, particular circumstances? So it was really trust that brought it all in. Still really digitally savvy among the top with the Latino community and the Asian community. We see it a lot with minority communities. And I would say we're not talking specifically around it today, but for the Asian community, very similarly around language and trust and really wanting to resource from the community's best experiences. That's what we've seen in our neurosocial networking research, which was really cool. I love. And at the end of it, what you get out of it, it's community and we're coming together for community, which sounds like one bullet point out of a big piece of research, but understanding all of those pathways really helps us understand why today we say off the cuff, Latinos use social networking more and word of mouth is very, prolific. But when we want to understand why, it's because of the way the communities have risen in the States and the lack of structure and support earlier on.
That's great, thanks. And so I'm curious, some might say, if we're talking exclusively about the Black and Latino communities and the need for, more culturally competent outreach, what's all the fuss about? Because this is really only 31% of the population. Why is this such a big deal? So, how would you respond to that, Mike?
Sure. I'd have a strong response, as you might guess. But yeah, look, let's just take the Latino alone, which I agree. If you add it up to 31%, my points are even greater. But we are almost, we're just over 18% of the population. So how can you ignore 1/5 of the most powerful economy in the world? Just U.S. Hispanic is bigger than all of Colombia, all of Argentina, all of Spain. It's the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Similarly, the economy, the GDP of U.S. Hispanic would be the 8th largest country in the world. It would be like saying we're going to ignore Brazil, which is number 9, by the way. So, it's quite remarkable if a company thinks that they can, sort of avoid this. And that goes for every company. It used to be that Procter & Gamble and McDonald's and Coca-Cola got it, but maybe now financial services. Again, 1 in 5 of America will need any product or service. And I think companies are thankfully starting to get it, hiring hopefully some experts like some of those on this call, hiring internal sort of centers of excellence to help guide their approach with that nuance I was talking about, and giving back to the community, again, in ways of shared value. You saw, just this week, a sort of coalition of banks announcing that for Black and brown audiences, for communities of color, they're going to be rolling out a lot of options, even for those that are unbanked. You can open a credit card without checking your credit. They're getting creative in ways to not only help themselves, but hopefully rise the community up along with them.
I'd add to, aside from what Mike just pointed out and the numbers, the demographics, the money behind it, in our industry, in mortgages and housing, this is where the growth is coming from. There was a recent, I believe it was the Harvard Center for Joint Housing Studies, and the minority segments are the only segments that are growing. In particular, Latino segment is propelling and driving the household formation, while the white market actually is going down. So this is where the consumers are. So it's just mind-boggling, any company that wouldn't put resources towards it. But we have to be very intentional there, because there's less than, I believe it was 13% of the housing industry is diverse. And so that's a huge gap between the the future of the household formations and who's actually serving those potential customers.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Stacey, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think too that it's, or I think it's important to understand. I don't think that they're necessarily ignoring or not wanting to invest in this segment. I think they just don't know how, because when we talk about the Latino community, we're talking about a large community. But the truth is, as Mike and both you, Maria, have brought up, there are segments within this community that need our attention in different ways via different platforms. Right? I mean, when you're thinking of older Latinos, 55 plus, I think there's such a need to really understand the community in a way that the brands that are currently working to do this, financial services or otherwise, can't quite get their heads around how to do this. As an example, when we think of Latinos 55 plus, one of the examples I used to make, and it still rings true, is that Latinos 55 plus are nothing like non-Hispanic white 55 plus. Complete polar opposites, right? If you're a Latino 55 plus, your kids are gone and they're in college, like they're out of the home. But generally speaking, when you look at the data, if you're white, non-Hispanic, and you're 55 plus, your kids probably may even be in high school still at your home. Your experience is totally different. But what that means for financial services is you have this availability of income that is not available in the same way in white non-Hispanic households, right? You have these lifestyle curves that come at different points. That also means that home purchases come at different points because family home formation, as you talked about, come at different points. And sometimes it's reverse of traditional. So sometimes you'll first see children, then maybe marriage, then education, then home purchase. The orders could be all different, but really needing to understand those segments. And so that's why I feel like a lot of the investment isn't being made. I feel like the story is there, that there is value and a great return on investment, but it's a lack of understanding of the nuances of the community that are what are holding brands back. Which product at which life stage? How are we going to organize that? And then which medium is it? Are we going to think about, to all digital placement and think about who our ad servers are serving to for 55 plus versus a different type of placement for our younger adults that have different financial needs. Everyone's talking about wealth building. I feel like the marketplace is confused, which is why you really need an organized agency who is thoughtful and very well versed in bringing forward all of these strategies.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear you both talking about data, and just building off of what Maria said, Urban Institute released a study that just noted that between 2020 and 2040, 70% of all homeownership growth is going to come from the Latino community. And we're talking about, to Mike's point, a segment of the population that's just 18% of the population driving the lion's share of homeownership growth in the country for the foreseeable future. And, certainly most efforts that we've seen in the financial services segment are, I would say, superficial at best in terms of how to reach out to this population. And they tend to involve translating a website into Spanish or, doing something for Cinco de Mayo. And, while I think that, to your point, Stacey, that probably comes from a place of lack of information or know-how, I wonder what advice, we can give to companies that really want to line up, meeting their corporate values, which are well-intended values, with the market opportunity in that way. So, Mike, I wonder if you can share a little bit about how can companies do that correctly?
Sure, and thankfully we've had a lot of experience in this space. As you know, we're working with Realogy, but also with Envoy Mortgage. So kind of on both sides of that equation, we're helping them target Latino audiences. And, I think a lot of the same kind of trends and rules apply, that you want to do your homework and communicate with good intent and respect, but some unique ones do too. A lot of companies are fearful that if they get the message and the marketing right, but their infrastructure isn't ready, is that going to be an unfair dynamic? So you get the inbound interest, but if you don't have a call center, a Spanish language website, or trained, real estate professionals that are able to communicate in Spanish, are you doing a disservice to the market? My opinion is, in the United States in particular, almost any acculturation level has learned to navigate on some way in English. So you can't open a bank account in Spanish. You cannot go into a Bank of America, even in East Los Angeles or in Chicago, or at some point you're going to have to fill out paperwork in English in this country. And maybe it's your son or the neighbor or someone that helps you. But I still believe that engaging them in an emotionally resonant way that respects their unique values and culture, and communicating, and here's a big important part, communicating candidly that they may need some English language support along the way. I have all the faith in the world that that's an ethical approach, that it in fact is complementary of the Hispanic community, and it's a way to at least dip your toe before you start to revamp your entire infrastructure.
I couldn't agree more with what Mike just said. And I think that a lot of the folks that are on this call listening to us, especially those in lending, mortgage lending, will say, well, there's something called UDAP, the Uniform Deceptive something practices. Basically, what I've heard a lot of lenders say, their worry is that if they do something or start something in language, then per that regulation, everything therein has to fall in that language, and they're not prepared to do so. And what Mike just said, you don't have to do that. Don't let that prevent you from dipping your toe in the water. You can do things that are in English that are culturally very attuned and are speaking without using a word of Spanish to the Latino market. An example of how that's possible is kind of just the lens that you look at things through. So in the American culture, we often say what's good for me is therefore good for my family. And that's wonderful. Nothing is wrong with that. The difference and the different lens with the Latino segment is what's good for my family is then good for me. And so a very subtle change, it's still the same, right? It still kind of means the same, but how you're communicating that sentiment is different with that different point of view.
Absolutely. And that's the, collectivist culture nature of the community, which is interesting, right? People often think about, well, over time, collectivist cultures are, the longer that you're here in the US, that's sort of going to dissipate. But the reason it doesn't is the reason I shared earlier, which was the really tightness of the community as a result of the community's growth in the United States. So that really keeps this collectivist culture center, where, as you said, what's good for, my family is good for me. It's really more about the community and those sorts of nuances in things like just creative treatments, and I know Mike can probably speak to this a lot better than I could, but there's nuances. And I'm not talking about, we've all seen the work that's been done by some amazing brands during, for example, like Halloween. And there's the, ofrenda kind of like in the corner. And you're like, oh, look, there's a Latino touch over there. Like I'm feeling included. It's not that kind of nuance. I'm not talking about sort of that. And that is, by the way, a great ad, if you know which one I'm talking about. Loved seeing it. But then again, that's also not across all cultures. I'm Cuban. And so that's, it's a little different. But there are other nuances that are shared across all of the countries of origin, such as, this sense of family. And I think we say that kind of off the cuff and everyone thinks they know it, but that kind of nuance coming through in creative really does take an expert and an expert understanding of the community too.
Yeah, Mike, I don't know if you wanted to jump in there a little bit.
No, I think there's definitely a creative, part of the challenge, and if you're in an ad agency, is if you're just targeting Anglos, you need to do two really hard things. You need to do extremely creative, kind of innovative, out-of-the-box work, and it needs to move product and actually work from a sales perspective. If you're a Hispanic advertising agency, you add one more thing. Now you have to do it for a sub-niche that is hypersensitive, that everybody's kind of judging whether it was a condescending stereotype or whether it was just tapping into a truism, an insight. So it's a challenge, but therein lies the fun. And I think the brands that get it work really hard to make sure they've done their homework, but then they hopefully give a little bit of leeway to do some interesting work, because if it's cookie cutter to avoid all risk, it's probably not going to have much success either. So, some of our clients, whether it's Heineken or T-Mobile, allows us to kind of flex our muscles because I think they trust we are Hispanic. I'm a quarter Mexican and half Cuban. So if it's going to offend, we'll probably have someone in our ranks that's gotten offended. So we're not, right. It's not guesswork. And I think that that's part of the approach that they should take.
And perhaps one of the things we should address too is, I think even I've said several times, well, talk to your agency but perhaps you don't necessarily have those resources, depending on, who. I know we have a lot of financial services on the line, and those resources certainly exist. But for others, there are a lot of places where there's resources available to better understand the community, not the least of which is doing your own research and census, which I know using that PUMS data is a nightmare, but there's lots of wonderful YouTube videos to help you out with. But also Nielsen has available, we have a lot of data available on just understanding basic information about the community. In fact, we just released, and I'm going to look for it in just a second, so I can share it. But we just released a report on the financial services industry and sentiments around. So there's certainly a lot of work being done by Realogy and by folks right here on this call and folks within your network. But there's also a lot of data out there as well that you can, if you don't have resources, or if you really just need some great Sunday reading, this is the place where you can grab some context, get comfortable with some of the language and the nuances we're talking about, understand the marketplace, and then perhaps have that next level dialogue with either your agency or, take the information that you have and extend. But there are a lot of resources out there. Perhaps the best thing, one of the things we can do is figure out how to toolkit this data, right? How do we toolkit or resource in an easier way for people to access and do some of their own learning? Not because we don't need the services of experts in this space, because we absolutely do, but we all want to make sure that we have, at least a baseline level understanding of diverse communities and their needs.
There's a lot of information out there. The other very underutilized source of information are ERGs, or employee resource groups. Most companies have them. And they're usually underfunded or don't have a budget. They're looking for content. They're looking to be more business resource groups, and not just swapping recipes monthly. They would be a great resource as well to take a product development idea, maybe using them as a focus group. A sounding board for strategy. There's lots of great intel in the companies, themselves.
Maria, I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier that has to do with both the growth in the market specific to certainly housing and financial services, but the low single and low double-digit representation of individuals who actually reflect the consumer within financial services. Certainly, that's the case within real estate. I wonder if you can offer some advice on what companies can do to find the people that they, that are reflective of the community that they want to serve. Because, we've certainly all heard from our various points of familiarity that it's difficult for companies to find people from the communities that they're trying to serve, but we're out there. And so what can they do to be able to actually, recruit and source talent that's reflective of this growing, these different growing segments?
Yeah, so the talent is out there, but it's not as easily to find, because we are the diverse segments is only now getting into financial services. So generationally, we're going to have, this won't be a problem for long because of the demographics and how it's changing. But it wasn't an industry that we grew up in. A lot of folks who come into the industry before us did so because their relatives, their family members, their mom, dad, tias, uncles, whoever were in that, and that's how they broke in. So we didn't have that background. So you have to be very deliberate, and sometimes we don't even know the things that we're doing that are preventing us from sourcing that. So there might be a favorite college that institution goes to year over year for sourcing, and they're not going to. They may not have, likelihood they don't have a high representation of diverse segments. So you'd have to be very purposeful where you're looking, how you're looking. maybe the recruiting strategy has to be more inclusive of more people making that decision in the household for that person. So it's a very deliberate plan. I often think of professional sports where they have scouts that go out and scour the schools and get in early in front of the students, and that's what's needed here. There's no shortcut to it. I do want to say Fannie Mae has a program called Future Housing Leaders that was created a couple of years ago to do just this and diversify the market. And we do this free of charge. It's because we understand that this is an important need, and we connect companies with diverse candidates for internships and hires. But you have to be very, very deliberate in finding that talent.
Yeah, I love the sports analogy. I don't think I've heard anyone actually reference like scouting for the right talent in art and music industry. I think that's great.
But that investment will yield you, a better return, right? I mean, that's kind of like what Mike and I were talking about. This is a little bit different, but that investment gives you a better return. I think back to when I first started my career, before I was in advertising, I worked at a bank, and I was far too young to be doing, I was very young. I was maybe 19 or something. And as a result of my speaking Spanish, I was tasked with things that were way outside of what I should have been doing. I was doing new loan docs and all sorts of things, only because I could speak to the community. And so, but that's, this is many, many, many years ago. But this, to your point, is like, we have amazing people now, but we always have, but our community is advancing on education like no other group. We are building wealth within our community. We are, just really on that trajectory. So finding this talent shouldn't be very difficult. The opportunity, I think, is really going to be in attracting this talent, because our Latino young people today who are well educated, understand their value if they're bicultural, and bilingual. And so it really is going to be an investment on the part of financial institutions to recognize what that yield is going to be, as we've been talking about, right? 2x, and then really investing in those young people, not only to carry them through, which I think the Fannie Mae program is amazing, but ensuring that we, resource them properly, that we pay them properly, and recognize the value that they bring. I saw something on Instagram a few days ago about bravery, and it said, what real bravery is? It's being willing to, and it's not just knowing 2 languages, but it's being willing to do your job and not your primary one. And I thought that's a really great, a really strong quote. So I think we are looking at people, however, where their primary languages are both English and Spanish. They deserve to be compensated for that skill and talent.
I would just add one thing that I think we haven't covered. A lot of the discussion here has been how big companies can either help or benefit from Latinos. But I think we're missing that there's a booming small business sector of Latino-owned enterprises that frankly don't need the help, and they're crushing it and growing incredibly quickly without sort of the largesse of a JP Morgan when they make an announcement. And I think those people are entirely Hispanic in many cases. And it's I think pre-COVID and hopefully post was growing at a much faster rate than the Anglo general market. And so I think it's not just about sort of top down, but it's also bottom up.
Yeah, well, and for those businesses in particular, while they don't, maybe want to migrate themselves as workers into somebody else's firm, the outreach that they do need is to be able to help capitalize their business.
Yep.
So certainly there's some work to be done in terms of being the right resource for businesses that want capital to be able to grow their enterprise. Great comments. I wonder if we can go kind of back to data segmentation, because I think in financial services in particular, there's certainly there's a strong history of analyzing data that is other than the demographic component, purely for like the ROI purposes, but not necessarily looking at consumer type and sort of hyper segmentation based on geography and how to change your outreach based on that kind of data. Stacey, I know that you guys have done a lot in the way of looking at data differently to be able to understand how to better target consumers and to reach them with right messaging. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just about looking at data differently and maybe some lessons for industry on what they might do.
So the two things that I can think of if we're really talking about like looking at data truly differently, and this is a little more advanced, but looking at psychosocial components and like doing some real neuroscience research, because I feel like there are other components that aren't as simple as just demographic cuts. Even when you go down to country of origin, you really need to understand, behaviors and the like the psychosocial components of those behaviors. Like when you think about investment, there's a absolutely different perspective from Cubans than there would be, from Puerto Ricans. Like there really is, and I'm not just saying it's as simple as country of origin, because it isn't. But what it really there are a lot of components behind straight demographics that can help influence, how people might engage with different products. So when I think about how we're looking at data, we at Nielsen are really trying to go beyond standard demographic and geographic cuts, because it just doesn't tell us enough of what we need to know about any distinct community group. And so I think that's probably the most important piece that I would offer is, and sometimes it's not even necessarily around the individual's country of origin, but geographically. So as an example, we know in and around Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a really large Black community. Somali Black, generally speaking, right? That's a very different experience. While there are shared experiences among the Black American experience that is shared across the country, that a lot of the community have shared, that they have a very specific American experience being Black in America. But there are other influences, because that community is largely Somali, that would have a different influence or impact on their relationship with financial services in the U.S. I also think the financial services industry has a lot of work to do with the Latino community in particular, as a result of the dialogue, and all of the very public dialogue in the past several years. It's been several years, but the very public dialogue about issues around the community and financial services and how the community was served. I feel like there's a lot of catching up there that needs to be done. And that in and of it, I almost feel like that's sort of a precursor, right? Before we start going in and immediately trying to figure out how do we super serve this community that is going to be growing, they're going to be the fastest, growing. And when it comes to home purchasing, there sort of is this other component that we're not talking a lot about, but I feel like is very present.
That kind of goes back to that trust factor that you talked about earlier, though, and about building trust, or in this case, building back trust. And Maria, I know that you've had a lot of conversations with, certainly in your prior role with institutions about how to do that. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the kind of activities that would need to take place in general within the financial services industry to be able to build that trust.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Yes, so there's we mentioned a few of them before. Family and friends being a source of information. So how you collect the information, how it's disseminated, so social media versus maybe an old school of the workshops where you're going someplace to listen to someone speak. Which is very difficult if you have, a family to take care of, or if you're working multiple jobs and you can't get to that, at the time that they're offering it. And then influencers, and those influencers or centers of influence can be community organizations. It can be churches or even trade organizations, like what we have in financial services. We have minority trade organizations like NAREP, ARIA, NAREB. All of those build trust. So again, it goes back to that communal and collective. and gathering information from people closest to you.
Mike, I know you guys have done a lot of work with influencers as well, though different than the one we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's become, for better or worse, the most prevalent tool in the marketing toolbox these days. And I think for us, it's not if, but how. You can either just lose money by partnering in the wrong way and not generate ROI, and worse, you could put your reputation at risk if you partner with someone that is kind of a loose cannon on their social media and might say something the day before, the day after your partnership activates. So getting it right is important. But if you get it right, I think it's huge. It's sort of the borrowed credibility of someone that has a beloved and engaged large audience, and they're sort of lending you that for a day or two or a tweet or two. And but it's important. I think our playbook is usually it's got to be someone that is aligned with the brand, that feels organic and authentic. The toughest part is reconciling. You want the brand's message to come across, but you don't want it to feel like an ad for the influencer, so that you get a lot of eye rolls from their audience. So that kind of bridge is where the fun part and the challenge comes in. But if you can get that right, I think it can establish your brand as sort of a part of the conversation, not talking to, but having a dialogue with the Latino community.
That's great. So we do have a question from one of the audience members, from Fran Bonham. And Fran is asking about putting out materials in diverse languages. And so Fran's question is, when we talk to our local banks about their CRA obligations, does that excuse them from marketing to diverse communities in their own language because of that UDAP comment that you mentioned earlier, Maria?
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. That can you rephrase that for me, Marissa?
Yeah. So if banks are wanting to avoid translating materials, does
okay.
Yeah. Does that how does that impact into their CRA obligations?
Well, the UDAP doesn't prevent doing things in language. You can do things. You can start something in language that's not product specific, that's educational in nature. You can have a footnote on the material that says, that other connection points will be in English. There are ways you can address it that way. However, I do want to say, I think we all mentioned it, but maybe worth stressing. With regard to the the Latinx community, the largest growth segment is native-born Hispanics, meaning that we were born here and still identify as Latinx, but can go, in English or Spanish. And so it's not the language. It's not the language ability. It's how you're speaking to us and where you're speaking to us. And so that's where, if you're finding that if you can't get that message through to whomever it is in your organization, then maybe having a third party come in, like a Stacy or like a Mike, to help make those connection points a little bit more clear. But so that's my answer is, one, UDAP doesn't prevent you from doing something. There are ways of working around that. And then two, it's not always done in language.
Oh, it sounds like that's almost an educational opportunity, right? I mean, if they're not knowing and they're just thinking of all of the liability or risk, and so that therefore not doing it, that would carry forward beyond just materials. That would carry forward to ads, dialogues, social media dialogue in language. Like it just sort of feels like perhaps there's an educational opportunity there for the industry on what you can do. I often find that in my work, and really certainly even in, I'm sure we all lately face this in our work, where there's a whole lot of what we can't do. I mean, there's a lot. And I almost want to start meetings and say, okay, so we're all clear on what we cannot do. So now let's figure out what we can do. That's what we're here to talk about. And I feel like, perhaps that's an opportunity for the industry, is to do more advocating around how we get over those hurdles so that you can have this authentic dialogue in language and even fluid in multiple languages and in English and Spanish in different spaces without the fear. It's a really good question that Fran brought forward, because for me, it's outside of my area of expertise, but as an outsider absorbing this, I can feel, even from what you said, Maria, like the genuine, sort of concern around the risk here. And it feels like an opportunity to have some clarity.
I totally agree for what it's worth. And I think specific to the, do you need to translate everything? I'm honestly positive you don't. You just have to jump through a ton of hoops to get it right, ethically as well as legally. Those hoops include, the disclaimer and the sort of transparent, you will need an English speaker to help. And maybe taking it a little bit further than all or nothing. You don't have to translate every single page and legalese of your website, but having some kind of landing page that explains in a pretty simple way what they're going to get. So there's a confluence of factors you need to get right, but I think the intent of starting is where it's at. I think it's important that you at least dip a toe.
That's great. So we've got a few minutes left to wrap up, and I'd love to just get some kind of like parting words of wisdom from each of you. And I wonder, Maria, if we can start with you. So if you had to kind of issue a takeaway or two for folks, what would that be? And then we'll go next to Mike and then Stacy.
Okay. I would say, it's not different. The diverse segments, the approach and the strategy isn't different than the general market. And it's funny because maybe that sounds too simple, but I think when we start talking about that, a lot of people either are like deer in headlight and they get frozen. They're like, I don't know what to do. Well, just do how you would normally do it, but with a different lens. But it starts with research. Research your the market that you're trying to connect with. Do you have the right people? Do you have the right products? Do you have the right promotion? Do you have the right pricing? It doesn't have to be that difficult. The difficult part is just getting, I think, the right team in place, so that whatever you don't know can be covered by someone who is on that team that's culturally competent.
I guess my final word is a bit of a pivot, but one of my biggest frustrations is when a brand says, well, why do I need to do this? This is the market's going to assimilate. Everyone's going to be speaking English. Every other immigrant group that came before is no longer a sub-segment we need to target. And there's just some fundamental reasons why that will never happen, in my humble opinion. The first is geography. If you were at the turn of the previous century crossing the Atlantic from Ireland or Poland or Russia or Italy, that's a pretty different dynamic than you abutting Central America and Mexico and being right next to your country of origin. Secondly, there's technology. So you're talking to your family in that language on WhatsApp all day long. That was also not the case for any other immigrant population. And third would be the media landscape. You've got Univision, Telemundo, Estrella. These are feeding you in Spanish, in culture, what you want, your sports, all day in the United States. And so that's going to create a stickiness where even second, third, fourth generation, eventually Latinos, I think, are going to be more inextricably tied to their culture than previous immigrant groups that came before.
And there's they have covered it sufficiently. So the only thing I guess I would add is, let's not let fear drive what we can and cannot do, but rather let opportunity drive it, right? And that sounds like I read it out of one of those calendars, and I didn't. But that's so easy to say. It's easier said than done. But if you're in this industry, your goal is, and I'm sure it is for all of us, we want to serve the clients well, but we also want to continue to see this industry grow. Going back to the very first comments of this session, if you take a look at the community and just how the U.S. is, the demography of the U.S. is shifting, it's revolutionizing what America looks like. It just makes perfect sense. Yes, we're talking about segment marketing and we're talking about diverse communities and outreach. But even if you back up from that and say, where is my next, great success? Where is my next big client base coming from? It's no surprise that it would be the Black or Hispanic community as the largest, Hispanic community specifically as the largest growing, the Asian American as the fastest growing, and the Black community certainly, a significant community with 14% population as well. It only makes sense to shift some of those dollars, especially when you look at life cycle curves and you take a look at where, the total market or where non-Hispanic whites are today. A lot of those big investments and those purchases and those those financial engagements have taken place. And so if you're looking at your next great consumer and your next big leap, it's going to be this community group. So looking for that opportunity and, understanding exactly what that opportunity is and getting your feet wet at trying to advance in the space. That's my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you all for all of your comments. Really great dialogue. I know that our conversation today has mostly centered around the Latino community in some sense, some of the nuances with the Black community. Before we call it a day and we wrap up, we did just get one last question that came in, and I'd love to be able to address it. And Maria, since you're in the financial services industry, I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking this question for us. That there's the Biden administration recently issued a rule to prohibit banks from discriminating against LGBTQ plus people. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about financial services and what the industry is doing to improve engagement with and outreach to like this specific segment of the U.S. population.
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know about the specific Biden ruling that you're talking about, but I did mention the minority trades that have been around for a while, and also there are trade groups for gay community as well. And within the banking industry and housing industry, it is heavily regulated against discriminatory practices. But I fear, though, that it's more those overt practices, and we have to be very cognizant and observant of our colleagues that things aren't happening in a disparate way as well. So though I'm glad to hear of that ruling, and that any type of discrimination is illegal. But I would also just be cautious that in financial services, in any industry, that we need to not be complacent by just the letter of the law, but spirit of it too.
Great, thank you.
Well said.
Yes, I want to thank you all again. Love the dialogue. Love the focus on really doing things, in language based on preference versus proficiency, like what Mike talked about, and really highlighting the market segment opportunity, both to benefit the community, but also from an economic perspective for the country. So thank you all so much, and appreciate your comments, and look forward to just being involved with you in other different ways as things move on throughout the year.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Had fun. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.